Emily Carter threw the ledger across the counter so hard it knocked over the ink jar, and she did not stop to clean it up. Her hands were shaking. Her jaw was locked tight. And every word Charlotte Bennett had just said to her face was still ringing inside her chest, like a bell that refused to go quiet. A man like Nathaniel Hayes does not choose women like you, Emily. He never will. Stop embarrassing yourself before the whole town sees it. She had smiled when Charlotte said it. She had stood there behind her own counter in her own store built by her own hands. After her father died, and she had smiled like it didn't split something open inside her. But now Charlotte was gone, and the smile was gone with her, and Emily pressed both palms flat against the wooden counter and breathed until the shaking stopped. If you are watching this story right now, I want to ask you something before we go any further. Have you ever worked twice as hard as everyone around you, done everything right, held everything together, and still been told you were not enough? Then this story was written for you. Please subscribe to our channel and follow Emily's journey all the way to the end. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to Willow Creek, Montana, and find out who Emily Carter really was before Nathaniel Hayes ever walked through her door. The supply store on the main street of Willow Creek, Montana, had no sign above the door anymore. The paint had peeled off 2 winters ago, and Emily hadn't replaced it, not because she couldn't afford to, but because she'd decided that everyone in this town already knew where Carter's supply was. They'd been coming here for 20 years. They didn't need a sign. They needed what she had, and they knew it even when they pretended otherwise. Emily Carter was 27 years old. She was tall, broad-shouldered, with strong hands that had spent more time lifting crates and hauling grain sacks than most men in Willow Creek would ever admit. Her hair was dark brown, almost black, and she kept it pinned back in a way that said she didn't have time to think about her hair. She wore practical dresses always. Nothing that would catch on a nail or drag through a puddle. She moved through her door, the way she moved through everything, fast, deliberate, no wasted motion. She was the heaviest woman in town, and the people of Willow Creek had made sure she never forgot it. Not with cruelty, exactly. Small towns rarely worked that way. It was subtler than cruelty. It was the way conversations stopped when she walked into a room and started again differently. It was the way mothers guided their daughters away from Emily, not because she'd done anything wrong, but because proximity to her felt like the wrong kind of association. It was the way the men who needed her expertise on water rights or supply negotiations would talk to the wall behind her head rather than meet her eyes directly. It was the way no one had ever asked her to dance at any frontier gathering in the 10 years she'd been attending them. Emily had stopped counting the dances she hadn't been asked to years ago. She'd stopped hoping for them even longer ago than that. What she had instead of any of that was the store. After her father, Thomas Carter, died of a chest fever 3 years prior. He'd left behind a business that was quietly drowning. Emily had known it was in trouble before he died. She'd been the one keeping the real accounts while he kept the ones he showed to the bank. She'd seen every borrowed dollar, every overdue payment, every rancher who owed money, and had started avoiding the store. Thomas Carter was a good man and a generous man, and generosity without accounting was just slow financial collapse. When the funeral was over, Emily sat down with every ledger her father had owned, spread them across the kitchen table, and did not get up for 2 days, except to sleep for a few hours and eat something small. By the end of those 2 days, she had a complete picture of where they stood, what was owed, what could be recovered, and what had to be let go. She let go of the 2 outbuildings her father had been paying lease on. She collected every outstanding debt with a patience and persistence that made grown men uncomfortable because they hadn't expected a woman to come after what was owed with that level of quiet determination. She renegotiated the supply contracts with 3 different freight companies, playing them against each other until she got rates her father had never managed to achieve. Within 18 months, Carter's supply was not drowning anymore. Within 2 years, it was the most reliably stocked and most efficiently run supply operation between Billings and the Wyoming border. The ranchers needed her. The farmers needed her. The families who were trying to build something on this frontier needed what she could source, what she could organize, and what she knew about the land and the water and the seasons that governed whether any of them would make it or fail. None of that changed how the town looked at her. "Emily's a good woman," people said, and the way they said it meant she's useful. "We're glad she's here, but let's not talk about her as though she's something more than useful." She had a talent for numbers that bordered on unsettling. She could look at a parcel of land and tell you, based on the elevation, the surrounding terrain, and the historical rainfall patterns she'd memorized from every survey report she'd ever gotten her hands on, whether that land would support cattle for a decade or fail inside of 3 years. She understood water the way some people understood music, not as something she'd studied formally, but as something she had an instinct for that went deeper than study. She was also funny, though almost no one in Willow Creek had ever spent enough time with her to discover that. She had a dry, quiet humor that showed up sideways in observations that would land a full second after she'd said them, and then they'd hit harder for the delay. Her friend Ruth Halverson, who ran the laundry on Pine Street, was the only person who laughed with her regularly and without effort. "You're the smartest person in this town," Ruth told her once, sitting in the back of the store after closing, sharing a pot of tea that Emily had somehow managed to source from a merchant in St. Louis. "You know that, don't you? Being the smartest person in Willow Creek isn't exactly a high standard," Emily said. Ruth laughed until she spilled her tea. Emily smiled, but there was something behind the smile that she didn't put words to, something Ruth probably saw because Ruth had been paying attention to Emily for years. It wasn't bitterness exactly. It wasn't self-pity. It was more like a tiredness, the kind that comes not from working hard, but from working hard in a direction that never quite arrives anywhere you wanted to go. She wanted more than the store. She had always known that, and rarely let herself think about it directly, because thinking about it directly made the wanting too sharp and too specific and too easy to have disappointed. She wanted to be known, not for her usefulness, not for her ledgers and her freight rates and her water knowledge. Known the way people knew each other, when they paid actual attention, when they listened, not for the parts that were useful to them, but for the parts that were just the other person existing, mattering, being worth listening to. She had never had that from a man. She had understood for a long time that she probably never would. Willow Creek had taught her what she was worth on the marriage market, and the lesson had been delivered so many times in so many small ways that she'd eventually stopped arguing with it. Charlotte Bennett had not been wrong, really. That was the cruelest part of what Charlotte had said. It wasn't that she'd made something up. It was that she'd said out loud what Emily had always privately believed. A man like Nathaniel Hayes did not choose women like Emily Carter. The world didn't work that way. Nathaniel Hayes arrived in Willow Creek on the 3rd Tuesday of June, and Emily knew he was coming 2 days before he got there, because the freight manifest that crossed her counter mentioned a large equipment order being diverted through the territory from a Texas operation called Hayes Cattle and Land. She'd done what she always did with new information, filed it away, thought about it at odd moments, built a picture from the pieces she had. A Texas cattleman coming north meant expansion. Expansion, this far north, meant someone who either had a lot of capital or a lot of nerve, possibly both. The equipment manifest suggested capital. The choice of Willow Creek as a stopping point, given that it was not the most obvious route from Texas northward, suggested that someone had told him specifically to come here, which meant he'd done his research, which meant he was smarter than the average man arriving with money to spend. She'd thought about it for 2 days, built her picture, and then set it aside because she had actual work to do, and speculating about wealthy strangers was not productive. He walked into her store on a Wednesday morning 2 days after he'd arrived in town, and she knew who he was before he introduced himself, because Ruth had already described him to her in detail, that suggested Ruth had been paying closer attention than was strictly necessary. Tall, Ruth had said. Dark hair, green eyes. Looks like he's been working cattle his whole life, not just owning them. Carries himself like he's used to people getting out of his way, but doesn't expect it. Tipped his hat to Mrs. Alderman's daughter. Didn't look at her like she was a decoration, just tipped his hat and kept moving. "I don't know, Emily. There's something different about him." "There's something different about most people until you know them better," Emily had said. But she'd remembered the detail about the hat. He came through the door on Wednesday morning, and he was exactly as Ruth had described. And he looked around the store, the way people looked around her store when they'd heard about it but hadn't seen it, with a kind of quiet assessment that wasn't quite surprise but was definitely recalibration. "Miss Carter," he said. "That's right." He crossed to the counter and took off his hat, which was the kind of gesture that had gone out of fashion in some of the newer towns, but persisted in the older ones among men who'd been raised to mean it. "Nathaniel Hayes, I've heard you know this territory better than anyone." "Depends on who you heard that from." Tom Briggs out of Billings, and before him a man named Carver, who said you'd talked him out of buying a parcel near the North Fork that turned out to be mostly seasonal floodplain. "Henry Carver," she said. "He was annoyed with me at the time. Took him 2 weeks to admit I was right." Something moved across Nathaniel Hayes's face, the beginning of a smile held back, but not very effectively. He was considerably more generous about it by the time he mentioned you to me. "What are you looking for, Mr. Hayes?" "Land," he said. "Good water access elevation that won't turn against you in a hard winter room for a significant cattle operation to expand without running into boundary disputes inside the first 5 years. I've looked at 4 parcels in the last week, and I don't love any of them." "Which 4? He named them. She listened, and while she listened, she was also running the properties against everything she knew about this territory. The water table data she'd accumulated over years of conversations with ranchers and surveyors and old-timers who remembered floods that happened before any official records were kept. "The Delacroix parcel has good elevation," she said when he finished. "But the creek that runs the northern boundary runs dry by late August in any year that doesn't get above-average spring rainfall, and this territory does not average above-average spring rainfall. You'd be hauling water by September." The Delacroix agent said the creek was reliable. "The Delacroix agent has never spent a late August in this county." He looked at her steadily. Not the way most men looked at her, which was at a point somewhere slightly above or beside her actual face, the conversational equivalent of a polite sidestep. He looked at her directly, with an attention that felt specific. "What would you recommend?" he said. "Come back tomorrow," she told him. "I want to look at something before I answer that." She expected him to push back. Men with money usually did. They wanted answers immediately. They wanted to be served on their schedule. They didn't understand why anyone else's process might require time. "All right," he said. He put his hat back on, gave her a nod that was somewhere between acknowledgement and respect, and left. She spent that evening pulling together every survey record, rainfall log, and property boundary document she had that pertained to the parcels she was thinking about, and she cross-referenced them against the notes she'd accumulated from ranchers who'd worked the territory for 20 years or more, and by the time she was done, she had a clear recommendation and a second recommendation in case the first didn't suit him, and she'd also spent considerably more time on the question than the situation strictly required. She told herself that was because she liked a problem. That was true. It was not the complete truth. He came back the next day. He came back the day after that. Within a week, his daily visits to Carter's Supply had become a topic of conversation in Willow Creek, in the particular way that things became topics of conversation. In small towns, everyone knew about it. Most people had an opinion, and those opinions were shared in low voices that stopped when the subject of the conversation was within earshot. Emily was aware of the talk. She was always aware of the talk about her, the same way you're always aware of a sound that's been present so long. You've stopped actively hearing it, but would notice immediately if it stopped. What was different now was the register of the talk. It wasn't the usual background commentary on her size or her situation, or the mild social pity she'd absorbed for years. It was something sharper, something that had an edge of threat underneath the gossip. She understood why. She wasn't naive about what his visits looked like to the town or what they might mean. She was more careful about what she let herself believe they meant. Ruth sat across from her in the back of the store on a Friday evening and said, "He looks at you different." "He looks at me like a business contact," Emily said. Emily. "He's a wealthy Texas rancher who needed expert land advice. I gave it to him. That's the entirety of what's happening." "He stayed for 2 hours yesterday," Ruth said. "You talked about water rights for 20 minutes. I know because I was here for part of it. What did you talk about for the other hour and 40 minutes? Emily was quiet for a moment. "His family," she finally said. He grew up on the ranch his father built it from nothing, which is why he understands what it takes. He has a younger sister he's very protective of. He's been running the operation alone since his father died 4 years ago, and he hasn't slept a full night since, because there's always something that needs deciding. Ruth was looking at her with an expression that Emily didn't want to examine too closely. "And you told him things," Ruth said. It wasn't a question. "Some things." "What kinds of things?" Emily looked down at the ledger in front of her, which she was no longer actually reading. "About my father. About the store after he died. About what it was like to do the accounting and realize how much trouble we were in and know that I was the only one who was going to be able to do anything about it." "You don't tell people those things," Ruth said quietly. "In the 3 years I've known you well, you have never told me half of that." "I know. So why did you tell him?" The honest answer was that he had asked. Not the way people asked when they were being polite and didn't actually want to know. He had asked the way people asked when they were paying real attention, when they had put down whatever they were carrying and turned fully toward you, when the question wasn't a bridge to whatever they actually wanted to say, but was genuinely the thing they wanted to know. She hadn't had a lot of experience with that kind of question. She hadn't known how to resist it. "He's easy to talk to," she told Ruth. Which was true, but not the whole truth. And Ruth knew it was not the whole truth, but let it go. Charlotte Bennett came into the store on a Thursday morning when she had never come into the store on a Thursday morning in the entire time Emily had been running it. Charlotte had her own arrangements with the dry goods merchant and generally regarded Carter's Supply as a place beneath her particular requirements. She came in alone, which was unusual. Charlotte generally moved with at least one companion, another young woman whose primary function was to be slightly less beautiful than Charlotte, so that Charlotte's beauty was properly contextualized. She stood on the other side of the counter from Emily, and she said without any prelude, "I want to know what you think you're doing." Emily kept her hands on the ledger she'd been updating. "I'm doing inventory, Charlotte. What can I help you with?" "You know that's not what I'm asking about." "I know what you're asking about. I'm choosing to answer a different question." Charlotte's eyes were blue and very pretty, and right now they had something in them that was not quite anger, but was close to it. Something that came from a place of genuine incomprehension, as though the world had presented her with a situation that simply did not compute against everything she'd been told about how the world worked. "I was supposed to come to the alderman dinner," Charlotte said. "He was invited specifically. Everyone understood what the invitation meant." "I don't know anything about Mr. Hayes's dinner engagements." "Stop calling him Mr. Hayes as though you're being formal. Everyone in town can see what's happening." Emily set her pen down. She looked at Charlotte directly. "What exactly is it that everyone in town can see?" "That you're making yourself available to a man who is out of your reach," Charlotte said, and she said it the way she might have said that the weather was cold or the road was muddy, as a simple statement of observable fact. Not cruel, exactly, just certain. "Emily, I'm not trying to be unkind. I'm trying to be honest with you because no one else will. A man like Nathaniel Hayes, his family, his money, his position, he will not choose you. He's being friendly because he needs your business knowledge, and that is entirely appropriate and fine. But you need to understand what it is and what it isn't before you embarrass yourself." The store was quiet, except for the sound of wind moving past the front door. Emily was aware of her own heartbeat, in a way she didn't usually notice it. She was also aware with a precision she found somewhat remarkable of exactly how much of what Charlotte had just said she had already said to herself in the dark, in the private hours of the night, in the voice she used when she was being honest with herself about what was likely and what was not. "Thank you for your concern," Emily said. Her voice was completely steady. "Emily." "I said thank you for your concern, Charlotte. Was there something you needed from the store today?" Charlotte looked at her for a long moment with that blue-eyed incomprehension, and then she straightened her back and turned and walked out. Emily stood at her counter for a moment without moving. Then she reached for her pen and went back to the ledger and added a column of figures that came out exactly right because her hands were steady and her eyes were clear, and she had had a great deal of practice at making sure the numbers worked even when everything else was tilting. The following Saturday, Nathaniel came in at his usual time mid-morning, and he was not alone. He had a man with him, his foreman. He explained, a quiet, weathered man named Giles, who nodded at Emily with the specific respect of someone who had been told she was worth respecting and had decided to take the recommendation seriously. They were looking at a decision point on the land negotiation that Emily had been helping him navigate, and she walked them through it at the counter, using the maps she'd marked and the survey documents she'd annotated. And she watched Nathaniel follow the reasoning with an attention that she had come to recognize as characteristic, the way he tracked each step, not just to get to the conclusion, but because he was genuinely interested in the architecture of how you got there. Giles asked 2 questions. They were very good questions. Emily answered them and noticed Nathaniel watching the exchange with something that looked like quiet satisfaction. When Giles stepped away to look at something on the far wall, Nathaniel leaned slightly forward on the counter and said quietly, "You heard about the alderman dinner?" It wasn't quite a question. "I hear most things," Emily said. "I didn't attend." "That's your business, Mr. Hayes." "I didn't attend," he said again more deliberately, because I had already made a commitment for that evening. She looked up at him. "I told Tom Briggs I'd send him the full water assessment by end of that week," he said. "I needed your help finishing it, so I came here instead." She held his gaze for a moment. Tom Briggs's water assessment could have waited a day. "Yes," he agreed. His expression was steady. "It could have." The silence between them had a quality she didn't have a precise word for. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the opposite of uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who both understood something that neither of them was ready to say aloud, yet standing at the edge of it together without stepping back. "The 3rd parcel northeast of Clearwater Creek," she said, because she needed to say something practical and grounded and real. "I've been thinking about it since Tuesday. The boundary situation is more manageable than it looks on the first survey. If you want, I can walk you through what I found." "I want," he said. So she did. The confrontation with Charlotte had happened on a Thursday. By Friday, the version of it that was circulating through Willow Creek had been altered in the way that all stories got altered in small towns. The edges had shifted. The details had been shaded, and Charlotte had somehow become the reasonable party warning a deluded woman away from a situation that was going to end in humiliation. Emily heard the version from Ruth, who had heard it from the woman who worked at the fabric merchants, who had heard it from Charlotte herself. "She's not wrong that people are talking," Ruth said carefully. "I know." "Emily, what is this with him? What is it actually?" Emily was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that meant she was deciding whether to be honest or whether to give Ruth the same answer she'd been giving herself. The practical answer. The sensible answer. The answer that kept everything manageable and safe. "I don't know," she finally said, and that was honest. "I know what I feel. I don't know what it is because I don't know what it is on his side, and I'm not willing to build a whole structure on a foundation I can't actually see." "What do you feel?" Ruth asked. Emily looked out the front window of the store. Across the street, 2 women from the church social committee were talking and not looking toward Carter's Supply, but positioned in a way that made clear they'd been looking a moment ago. "Like myself," she said, "when I'm talking to him. Like the most myself I've been in years, maybe ever." She said it quietly, the way you say something you've been holding for a while and are not entirely sure you should release. "Is that so terrible?" Ruth asked. "It will be," Emily said, "if I'm wrong about what it means." She was closing up the store on the following Monday evening, the last light going golden and low through the front windows, when the door opened and Nathaniel Hayes came in. He wasn't there for business. She could tell immediately because he wasn't carrying anything, and his expression was different from his business expression, the attentive, organized look he brought to maps and survey documents. This was something else. Something that didn't have a category yet in Emily's experience. "I need to say something to you," he said, "and I'd like to say it while I can before I think about it too much and find reasons not to." She set down the bolt of fabric she'd been putting away and waited. "Charlotte Bennett came to see me," he said. Emily kept her face still. "She told me you'd gotten a certain idea about what my visits here meant," he said. She was very gracious about it, concerned. She wanted to make sure I understood that you might have developed an attachment that wouldn't be appropriate to encourage. He paused. She was very clear that she was only telling me because she was worried about you. Of course she was, Emily said. She suggested that I might want to be more careful about how often I came in so as not to give you false hope. The phrase landed in the room between them. Emily felt it in her chest, that specific weight, that familiar compression. I told her, Nathaniel continued, that if I were giving anyone false hope, I would deserve to be told so directly by the person whose hope it was. And that her concern, while noted, was not something I had asked for, and not something I intended to act on. Emily looked at him. I come here every day, he said, because every conversation I have with you is the most useful and most interesting conversation I have on any given day. I come here because you are the only person in this town who speaks to me like an actual person, rather than a financial opportunity or a social acquisition. I come here because somewhere in the last 3 weeks I have become. He stopped, looked briefly at the ceiling, looked back at her. Considerably more concerned with whether you are well than my general concern for most people's well-being would normally call for. The evening light came through the windows. Mr. Hayes, Emily said. Nathaniel. Nathaniel. The name felt different in her mouth than his title had, closer to something real. You should understand that I have had a great deal of practice at being practical about what is and isn't possible for me. I am telling you that, so you understand that what I'm about to say is not coming from a place of girlish foolishness. I know what this town thinks about what is appropriate for me and what I can expect from my life. I'm not asking what the town thinks, he said quietly. I know. She looked at him steadily. That's exactly what I'm afraid of. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, why? Because, she said, if you were asking what the town thinks, I would know how to handle it. I've been handling that my whole life. I know all the steps to that particular dance. She picked up the bolt of fabric again, just to have something to hold. It's the other thing I don't have any practice at. He looked at her for a long moment, and the quality of his attention was the same quality it always had: specific, present, genuinely interested in the thing it was looking at. Neither do I, he said. Not really. She laughed, short and surprised. You have no practice at Nathaniel. Women in 3 counties have been making themselves available to you since you arrived. Available isn't the same thing, he said. I've never talked to any of them the way I talk to you. She didn't know what to do with that. She stood there holding a bolt of fabric in a store she'd built from the ruins of her father's dream, and she didn't know what to do with the specific, careful, real thing Nathaniel Hayes had just said to her. Go home, she finally said. Come back tomorrow. Let me think. He nodded. He put his hat on. He walked to the door, and then he stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at her. Emily, he said. She met his eyes. I am not interested in what this town thinks you're worth, he said. I'm only interested in what I've seen for myself. Then he was gone, and the store was quiet, and the evening light was finishing itself against the windows, and Emily Carter stood in the middle of everything she'd built and felt for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember. Like the ground under her feet might be something she could trust. She didn't let herself believe it completely. She had too much practice at the alternative for that. But she didn't argue against it either. And that, for Emily, was as close to hope as she'd allowed herself to come in years. He came back the next morning, same as he always did, and Emily had spent the night deciding exactly 3 things. The first was that she was not going to pretend the previous evening hadn't happened. She'd spent too many years pretending things hadn't happened, smoothing over the places where life had been sharp and inconvenient, and she was tired of it. The second was that she was not going to let hope run ahead of evidence. She had seen too many women in Willow Creek build entire futures in their heads out of a man's passing attention, and then spend years recovering from the architecture of something that had never actually existed. She refused to do that to herself. The third was that she was going to keep doing exactly what she'd been doing, running her store, doing her work, being exactly who she was, and let whatever was happening between her and Nathaniel Hayes take whatever shape it was actually going to take, without her trying to push it into a shape she preferred. She had these 3 decisions lined up and ready when he walked through the door. He looked at her with the same expression he'd left with open, direct, not performing anything, and he said, "Good morning," and she said, "Good morning." And he came to the counter, and she had the Clearwater Creek parcel documents laid out because they did in fact have actual work to finish, and they worked for 40 minutes without referencing the previous evening at all, which was its own kind of answer, she thought. That they could do that. That the conversation from last night hadn't made the work uncomfortable or strange. That they both knew how to be two competent people doing a real thing together, without letting the other thing collapse into it. About an hour in, while she was explaining the boundary notation on the northeast corner, he said, without looking up from the document, "Did you think about it?" "Yes," she said. And I think," she said carefully, "that you should finish acquiring your land before either of us says anything else that we'd have to unsay if the situation turned out to be different than it appeared." He looked up from the document. "That's very practical." "I'm a very practical person." "You are," he agreed. "It's one of the things I find most—" He stopped, reconsidered. "Practical," he said, which wasn't what he'd been about to say, and they both knew it, and neither of them pushed it. But she noticed that he did not argue with her terms. He accepted them the way she'd come to understand he accepted most things, not as a concession, but as a genuine recognition that the terms were reasonable. That was something she was adding to her private accounting of who Nathaniel Hayes actually was, a list she was compiling with the same care she brought to her ledgers. He listened. He adjusted. He didn't perform patience, he actually had it. She was beginning to understand why that was so disorienting. She'd never encountered it directed at her before. Ruth arrived at the store at 10:30, ostensibly to drop off a bundle of cloth that Emily had ordered, but actually Emily understood to get a clear look at the situation with her own eyes. Ruth came through the back and went very still for about 2 seconds when she saw Nathaniel at the counter, and then she composed herself with impressive speed and said good morning, and set down the bundle and found reasons to be in the front part of the store for the next 15 minutes before Emily managed to communicate with her eyes that she needed to leave. Ruth left. Nathaniel watched her go with what might have been amusement. "Your friend is protective," he said. "She's my only friend," Emily said. "She's allowed." He looked at her when she said that. Not with pity, she registered immediately, which was the look she'd been braced for. With something more like recognition. "Same for me and Giles," he said. "A man can go a long time in this life without a real one." She hadn't thought about that, about the fact that money and position could leave a person just as isolated as the lack of them, just in different ways. The thought rearranged something slightly in how she understood him. "You should know," he said after a moment, still looking at the survey map, "that I've heard what people in this town are saying. About you. About why I come here. About what they think I must be thinking." He paused. "About what they think of you." She kept her expression neutral. And I want you to know," he said, "that their opinion of you is the most mistaken thing I have encountered since I arrived in Montana, and I have encountered some genuinely mistaken things." The word landed differently than she expected. Not as a compliment exactly, as a correction. As a man who dealt in facts stating a fact. She didn't know what to say to it, so she said, "The northeast boundary is going to require a secondary survey before you make an offer. I have a man I trust for that kind of work. I can send word to him today if you want." "Send word," he said. And that was how they moved: real work, real words, and underneath it something that neither of them was naming yet, but that both of them could feel the way you can feel a storm coming from 2 counties away before a single cloud has appeared. The storm that arrived first wasn't the one she'd been tracking. It came in the form of Robert Whitmore, which was not surprising in retrospect. Robert Whitmore was the kind of man who needed to be the most important man in any room he occupied, and Nathaniel Hayes's arrival in Willow Creek had been a problem for Robert Whitmore's self-concept from the first day. Robert owned the largest ranch currently operating in the county, or had until Hayes Cattle and Land started making offers on parcels that would make his operation look modest by comparison. Robert came into the store on a Wednesday midday when he knew, because Willow Creek was a small town and everyone knew everyone's schedule, that Nathaniel was out riding the Clearwater parcel with Giles and wouldn't be in until late afternoon. He stood at her counter with the particular posture of a man who believes physical size is an argument, and he said, "I need to talk to you about Hayes." "Good afternoon, Robert." "I'm not here for pleasantries, Emily. I can see that. What do you need?" "You're helping him," Robert said. "The land he's looking at, if he gets the Clearwater parcel, and the two adjoining it, he controls the primary water access for the North Range. You know what that means for every other rancher in this county." "I know exactly what it means," she said. "I've been watching this county's water situation for 8 years. A large, well-capitalized operation with a serious commitment to the territory is considerably better for the water table than the current pattern of underfunded parcels that can't afford proper management." Robert's jaw went tight. "You're choosing him over the people who've been here." "I'm doing my job, Robert. I advise people on land and water and business. That's what I do. I did it for your father when he was looking at the South Range expansion. I did it for the aldermans. I'll do it for anyone who asks." "He's not from here." "Neither were your grandparents," she said pleasantly. "I've seen the county records." The muscle in Robert's jaw was working hard. "People in this town have been good to you, Emily. Your family, your store. You owe something to—" "I owe this town honest work," she said, and her voice was quiet, but it had an edge that she didn't usually let anyone hear. "I've given it that every single day for 8 years. I don't owe it my professional judgment, and I especially don't owe it my loyalty to men who've spent those 8 years talking over my head and around my face because they don't like what I look like when I'm telling them things they need to hear." Robert stared at her. She looked back at him without blinking. "You're going to regret this," he said. "You should buy 200 pounds of flour before the end of the month," she said. "There's a supply disruption coming out of the South that's going to push prices up considerably. That's professional advice, free of charge, and it's probably more useful to you than this conversation has been." He left without the flour. She thought he'd probably be back for it by the end of the week. People who were angry at her usually still needed what she had. She was right. He came back on Friday. She sold him the flour without mentioning Wednesday. He left without thanking her, but the fact of his return was its own kind of acknowledgement, and she accepted it as such. Nathaniel heard about the visit. She hadn't told him she hadn't intended to tell him, but Giles had been in the hardware store on Wednesday afternoon, and the hardware store shared a wall with Carter's Supply, and the walls in Willow Creek's Main Street buildings were not built for privacy. He came in on Thursday morning, and he said, "Giles told me about Whitmore." "It was a routine disagreement," she said. "Robert Whitmore and I have had routine disagreements for years. He threatened you." He made an implication. "There's a difference." "Emily." His voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before, not quite anger, something beneath anger, something more controlled, and therefore more serious. "A man came into your store and threatened you because you were helping me. That is not a routine disagreement." She looked at him. "What would you like to do about it?" "I'd like to go and have a very clear conversation with Robert Whitmore about what kind of behavior is acceptable toward a woman who is—" He stopped. "Who is what?" she asked. He looked at her directly. "Who is important to me?" The store was quiet. She could hear the street outside someone's horse, a door opening somewhere down the block. "Nathaniel," she said. "I know," he said. "I know what you said. Practical. Evidence. I know." "Then you know I can't." "I know what you said," he repeated. "I'm not asking you to revise it. I'm telling you a fact. You are important to me. That is simply true, and I think you deserve to have true things said to you directly, rather than wrapped in careful language so they're easier to deny." She stood very still. "Don't go talk to Robert Whitmore," she said finally. "Why not?" "Because it will make everything worse, and you know it. Because it will look like a territorial gesture, and it will give him something to react to, and right now what he has is frustration with no outlet, which means he'll do nothing." She paused. "And because I handled it. I am capable of handling it. I would like you to trust that." He looked at her for a long moment. "I trust it completely," he said. "I don't like it." "You don't have to like it." "No," he agreed. "I suppose I don't." The tension in his jaw didn't fully leave, but he let it go visibly, made the decision to let it go, and she added that to her private accounting too. A man who could choose to stand down when he understood the reason for it. A man who was angry on her behalf and could still hear her tell him how she wanted it handled. She had not had a great deal of experience with that particular combination. The town's position on the situation crystallized over the following 2 weeks in ways that Emily tracked with the same methodical attention she brought to her ledgers. Ruth reported that the women in the church social committee had begun dividing into 2 camps. Those who thought Emily should be sensible about her expectations, and those who had started to defend her in the careful, hedged way that people defend something they believe in, but aren't quite willing to commit to publicly yet. Old Silas from the grain merchant had started being noticeably friendlier to her, which meant he'd seen something that had updated his calculation about which direction the wind was blowing. 3 different women she barely knew had found reasons to come into the store in the last week and spend 20 minutes buying things they didn't particularly need, and Emily understood that what they were actually doing was looking at her with a different kind of attention than they'd ever paid her before trying to see what it was that Nathaniel Hayes saw. She did not find this flattering. She found it faintly exhausting the way any late-arriving attention exhausts you when you've spent years in its absence. Charlotte was the one she was watching most carefully, because Charlotte was the one whose reaction mattered most to the social equilibrium of the town in ways that were practical and real. If Charlotte publicly dismissed the situation, the majority of the town's opinion would follow her. If Charlotte escalated, things would become unpleasant in specific ways that Emily had been mentally preparing for. What Charlotte actually did was neither of those things, which was the thing Emily hadn't anticipated. Charlotte stopped coming into any establishment that Emily might be in at the same time. She stopped mentioning Emily's name in conversation, according to Ruth's intelligence network. She had apparently decided that the most effective move was erasure to behave as though Emily Carter was such a small figure in this situation that she didn't warrant engagement. It was, Emily thought, actually the smartest play Charlotte had available, and it worried her more than confrontation would have because it meant Charlotte was not reacting. It meant Charlotte was planning. She mentioned this to Nathaniel on a Thursday afternoon because she had learned that she could mention things like this to him. The strategic, uncomfortable things she observed about how the world worked without him becoming defensive or dismissive or finding reasons why she was probably wrong. He listened to the whole thing with his usual attention and then said, "What do you think she's planning?" "I think," Emily said slowly, "that she's waiting for the Frontier Gathering next month. It's the largest social event of the year. Everyone who matters in this territory will be there. She's going to use it somehow. How? I don't know yet, but Charlotte Bennett has never done anything by accident in her life, and a month of strategic silence means she's building toward something." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Are you worried?" She considered the honest answer to that question. "Not the way you mean. I'm not worried about what she might do to my reputation. My reputation in this town has been a fixed quantity for years, and there's very little she can do to make it significantly worse." She paused. "I'm worried about what it might do to you, to your position here. You're still establishing yourself in this territory, and if Charlotte positions this in the right way with the right people, it could complicate your land negotiations." He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one where something she'd said had landed somewhere specific for him. "You're worried," he said, "about the impact on me." "Yes. Emily, I am a grown man with a substantial operation and a decade of experience, navigating exactly this kind of social maneuvering in Texas, which I promise you is considerably more vicious than anything Willow Creek can generate. I know that. I want to make sure you also know," he said, "that no version of what Charlotte Bennett might do at next month's gathering is going to change anything about where I stand." She looked at him. "You don't know what she's planning." "Doesn't matter." "It might." "Emily." The way he said her name stopped her. Not loudly, just with a weight that asked for a moment of actual listening. "I have spent my entire adult life surrounded by people who wanted something from me. My land, my money, my name, my connections. I know what that looks like from the inside of a conversation, and I know what it doesn't look like." He held her gaze. "Every time I walk through that door, you are thinking about the problem at hand. You are thinking about the water table and the survey boundaries, and the freight contracts, and whether Robert Whitmore is going to do something stupid, and whether my business decisions are sound. You are not thinking about what you can get from me. I charge you for the advice, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. At a very fair rate. A rate that covers my costs and a modest profit, which is the same rate I charge everyone. Yes, he said. Exactly. She understood what he was saying. She understood it fully, and the understanding settled somewhere inside her with a weight that was not uncomfortable, but was significant. The way important things always had a physical quality to them when they finally landed where they belonged. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she said, "The surveyor sent word this morning. He can do the Clearwater assessment by end of next week." "Good," Nathaniel said. "Send him." And they went back to work. The surveyor's report came back better than Emily had calculated, which was unusual because she rarely miscalculated, and when she did, it was generally in the pessimistic direction. The water access was more reliable than the initial survey had suggested. The boundary situation was cleaner than it had appeared, and there was a secondary spring on the northeast corner that hadn't shown up on any of the existing documentation. She was reading through the report at her counter when Nathaniel arrived, and she handed it to him without preamble. He read it in silence. When he finished, he looked up at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the careful, controlled attention he usually brought to business, but something looser, something that looked like relief mixed with something close to joy. "This is the one," he said. "Yes," she said. "I think it is. How did you know to push for the secondary survey?" "I talked to an old rancher named Clarence Ames about 15 years ago," she said. "He'd worked that range in the 60s, and he mentioned a spring in passing. It stuck with me. It wasn't in any of the official records, so I couldn't put it in the formal assessment, but I remembered it when I was looking at the parcel." He stared at her. "You remembered a detail from a conversation 15 years ago." "I remember most things," she said. "It's convenient for the work." "It's extraordinary," he said. "It's a good memory." "Emily." He set the report down on the counter. "What would it take to make you accept a compliment?" She blinked. It was such a specific, direct, slightly exasperated question that it caught her completely unprepared, which was not a state she was accustomed to. "I don't," she started, "because I have complimented your work and your intelligence and your judgment 17 times in the last 3 weeks, he said, and the slight exasperation had a warmth underneath it that made it something other than criticism. "And every single time you explain the compliment away. You give me the practical reason the thing happened. You attribute it to experience or habit or old conversations you can't believe you still remember. You do everything except simply accept that you are extraordinary at what you do." She opened her mouth, closed it. "The rancher I heard about you from first," Nathaniel continued. "Tom Briggs said that you had saved his operation twice in 12 years by telling him things he didn't want to hear. At times he didn't want to hear them. He said, and I'm quoting him accurately, that you were the best business mind he'd encountered in 30 years of ranching, and he'd wasted 10 years of those 30 not listening to you because of his own foolishness." He paused. He said it with genuine regret, not the polite kind, the real kind. She looked at the counter surface. Something in the region of her chest was doing something she wasn't fully in control of. "Tom Briggs talks too much," she said. "In this case," Nathaniel said quietly, "I'm very grateful that he does." The afternoon light moved through the front windows. From outside came the ordinary sounds of a Thursday in Willow Creek, a cart moving down the main street, someone calling a greeting to someone else. "The offer on the Clearwater parcel," she said. "I can help you structure it in a way that leaves room for the 2 adjoining parcels without tipping your hand on the intention. If you move on all 3 simultaneously, Whitmore's people will coordinate against you. If you take them in sequence with the right timing, you'll have the primary one secured before anyone understands the full picture." "All right," he said. His voice had something in it, something that recognized what she was doing, the returning to work, the rebuilding of the practical wall between them that she retreated to when things got too close to the center. He recognized it, and he let her do it. "Walk me through the sequence." She did. But she was aware while she walked him through it of a shift in the ground beneath her feet. Something had changed in the last hour. She wasn't sure what to do with the change exactly, but she was aware that it had happened and that it wasn't the kind of change you could simply go back from. Tom Briggs had said those things. Nathaniel had remembered them. And the way he'd looked at her when he said extraordinary, like the word was not a thing he was giving her, but a thing he was simply reporting. The way you report facts that are too obvious to require argument. She thought about that word at odd moments for the rest of the day. She thought about it while she was closing up, and while she was walking home, and while she was making supper, and she recognized the thought pattern for what it was, because she'd seen it in other women and never understood it until now. She was afraid to believe it, not because she thought he was lying. She'd spent 3 weeks watching Nathaniel Hayes be exactly who he presented himself as, and one of the things she'd concluded was that he had no talent for deception. Not because he was simple, but because he'd decided at some point that it wasn't worth the energy. He said what he meant. He meant what he said. She was afraid to believe it because believing it meant wanting it, and wanting it meant the possibility of losing it. And she had organized her entire life around not wanting things that could be taken from her. It was the most efficient self-protection she'd ever devised. It was also she was beginning to understand the most complete self-abandonment. Ruth found her sitting at the back of the store at 7:30 the next morning, which was unusual because Emily was never at the back of the store at 7:30. She was always at the counter at 7:30. "What happened?" Ruth said immediately. "Nothing happened." "Emily Carter, you are sitting in the supply room at 7:30 in the morning, looking at a barrel of flour like it wronged you. Something happened." Emily was quiet. "He said I was extraordinary," she finally said. Ruth sat down across from her. "What did you say?" "I told him Tom Briggs talked too much." Ruth closed her eyes for approximately 1 second. "Good Lord, Emily. What was I supposed to say?" "Thank you. You were supposed to say thank you. And then what?" "And then we acknowledge it completely. And then where does that leave us?" "At the Frontier gathering next month with Charlotte Bennett, doing whatever she's been quietly planning for 4 weeks while I stand there having decided I believe in something that the rest of this town is waiting to watch fall apart." Ruth looked at her with the particular expression she reserved for when Emily was being simultaneously the smartest and the most impossible person in any given room. "You're scared," Ruth said. "I'm practical." "Those aren't opposites, you know." Emily stood up and walked back toward the counter because the store opened in 30 minutes and she had actual work to do. Ruth followed her, and when they reached the counter, Ruth put her hand on Emily's arm and made her stop. "Listen to me," Ruth said. "I have watched you hold this store together through your father's death, and 3 hard winters, and Robert Whitmore being difficult, and Charlotte Bennett being Charlotte Bennett. I have watched you solve problems that would have broken most men in this county. You are the bravest person I know at every single thing except this one." Emily didn't answer. "What are you actually afraid of?" Ruth asked. The question sat in the air between them. Emily looked at her oldest friend, the one person in Willow Creek who had been paying attention to her for years, and she said the true thing. "That I'm not who he thinks I am," she said quietly. "That he's seeing something that isn't there. That he's seeing who he wants to see, and one day he'll look up and realize the woman he thought he was talking to was just Emily Carter, the woman nobody chose." Ruth was very still. Then she said, "What if that's exactly who he's been choosing all along?" Emily didn't have an answer for that. And it was the not having an answer that stayed with her through the rest of the day, through the customers, and the freight manifests, and the inventory counts, and the ordinary work of a Friday in a Frontier supply store, humming under everything. Like a question she hadn't figured out how to answer yet, but was no longer entirely sure she wanted to avoid. The answer came to her, not as a decision, but as a recognition, the way most real things come, not chosen so much as finally seen clearly enough to stop arguing with. It happened on a Monday morning 4 days before the Frontier gathering, when a woman named Ida Marsh came into the store. Ida was 63 years old, a widow who had run her late husband's farm alone for 11 years and done it well enough that her sons, when they'd grown, had chosen to stay and work beside her rather than leave for the cities the way so many young men did. She wasn't a woman Emily knew well. They'd exchanged pleasantries across the counter for years, conducted the ordinary transactions of commerce, nothing more. But Ida Marsh was the kind of woman who looked at things directly and said what she saw. And on this particular Monday morning, she set her supply list on the counter and said without any preamble, "I want you to know that what that Bennett girl said about you was wrong, and most people in this town know it, even if they're too cowardly to say it out loud." Emily went still. "I don't know what you're referring to." "Yes, you do," Ida said pleasantly. "And I'm not here to make you uncomfortable. I'm here to buy 2 months of dry goods, and to tell you one thing, because I'm old enough that I've decided life's too short to leave things unsaid." She looked at Emily with the direct, clear gaze of someone who had earned her opinions the hard way. "Don't you let their smallness become yours. You understand me, their smallness is theirs. It does not belong to you." She handed over her supply list and waited while Emily filled it, and they talked about the weather and the supply situation and the quality of the last flour shipment. And when Ida left with her goods, she turned at the door and said, "4 days. Don't waste them being afraid, honey." Then she was gone. Emily stood at her counter for a long moment. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work with something settled in her chest that hadn't been settled before. Nathaniel arrived at the usual time, and she was ready for him, not with defenses, but with the things she'd decided in the night, and confirmed when Ida Marsh walked out the door. He came in and she looked at him and she said before he could say anything, before he could set down his hat and begin the ordinary business of their morning, extraordinary. He stopped, looked at her. "You said it last Thursday," she said. "I didn't answer you correctly. I'm answering now." She held his gaze. "Thank you." Something moved across his face, not surprise exactly, but something close to it, something that looked like a man who had been patient for the right length of time and was now watching the patience become worth it. "You're welcome," he said. "Don't make it strange," she said immediately. He laughed a real laugh, short and genuine, the kind she'd heard from him rarely enough that each one felt like something collected. "I wouldn't dream of it." "Good." She reached under the counter and produced the documents she'd been working on. "The offer structure on the Clearwater parcel. I've drafted the sequencing. You'll want to review it before you meet with the land agent on Wednesday." He came to the counter and looked over the documents, and they worked, and the working had something new in it now. Not different in its substance, but different in its quality. The way a room feels different when a window that's been painted shut finally opens and lets in actual air. He left 2 hours later, and at the door he paused and turned back the same way he sometimes did, and said, "The gathering's on Friday." "I'm aware. I'd like you to attend with me." She looked at him across the length of her store. This was the thing Charlotte had been planning around. This was the moment Willow Creek had been building toward for weeks. She understood all of it with complete clarity, and she understood what it would mean, and what it would cost, and what it might become. "All right," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. "All right," he repeated, and there was a weight in the repetition that was its own complete sentence. Ruth came over that evening, and Emily told her. Ruth sat down on the wooden chair by the back window and was quiet for approximately 4 seconds, which was a record for Ruth in moments of significant information. "All right," Ruth finally said. "We have 4 days." "I don't need 4 days of preparation." "Emily, I own appropriate dresses. I know how to behave at a public gathering. I've been attending them for 10 years. You've been attending them and standing against walls for 10 years, Ruth said with the gentle directness that was one of the things Emily valued most about her. "This is different. This is walking in on the arm of the most talked about man in the territory, and standing in the middle of that room while every person in it looks at you and decides what to think." Emily was quiet. "I need you to understand something," Ruth said. "I have been your friend for 3 years. I know you better than almost anyone. And I am telling you right now that there is not a woman in that room on Friday who has more right to be there than you do. Not Charlotte Bennett. Not anyone." She leaned forward. "But you have to believe that yourself before you walk through that door. Because if you walk in already apologizing for being there, they'll see it. And if they see it, they'll use it." "I don't apologize," Emily said. "Not out loud, Ruth said. With your body, with the way you stand, with the way you make yourself smaller in rooms when people are looking. She paused. I've watched you do it your whole life, and you don't even know you're doing it. The truth of it landed precisely because it was true. Emily had known it in some wordless way for years, the shrinking, the systematic reduction of her own presence in spaces where presence felt dangerous. She'd perfected it so thoroughly, it had become invisible to her. Stand in your own space, Ruth said. Just that. You don't have to be anything other than what you are. Just take up the space you're actually entitled to. Emily said nothing for a moment. Then she said, You should have been a preacher. Ruth laughed. I have considered it. Wednesday came, and with it, the meeting between Nathaniel and the land agent, which Emily had structured and prepared, and which Nathaniel managed with the quiet, precise confidence of a man who knew exactly what he wanted and had done the work to know why he deserved it. She heard about it from Nathaniel afterward. The agent had initially tried to negotiate the price upward, which was expected, and Nathaniel had produced the secondary survey and the water data and the boundary documentation that Emily had organized, and the negotiation had shifted immediately and decisively in Nathaniel's favor. He tried twice more, Nathaniel told her, standing at her counter. Different angles. I just kept returning to the documentation. The documentation was correct, Emily said. Correct documentation is harder to argue with than anything else. He asked where I'd gotten the water analysis. She looked up from the ledger she'd been updating. What did you tell him? I told him I had the best land advisor in the Montana Territory, he said. He asked who. I told him Emily Carter. He didn't say anything for a moment, and then he said he'd heard that name. Henry Carver again, probably, she said. Probably. He seemed to recalibrate something. Nathaniel watched her. You have a reputation, Emily. Not the one the town gossips maintain. A different one among the people who've actually needed what you know. She looked back at her ledger. I know. Do you understand how valuable that is? I've never had trouble understanding the value of things, she said. Understanding their value to myself is a different exercise. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, That's the most honest thing you've said to me. I say honest things constantly. You say accurate things constantly, he said. That's not always the same. She set the pen down, looked at him. He was right, and she knew it, and the knowing had the slight sting of a thing you've successfully avoided thinking directly, and someone has just thought for you. Friday, she said. Friday, he agreed. Thursday arrived with bad weather, a cold front coming down from the north that had no business being so aggressive in June, but was because Montana weather had never cared about what was appropriate for the season. The freight delivery she'd been expecting was delayed, which meant reorganizing her entire Thursday around the gap it created, and she spent most of the day problem-solving through inventory arrangements and alternative sourcing, and sending 3 different letters to 3 different supply contacts. By 4 in the afternoon, she had managed it, which was satisfying in the particular way that logistics problems were satisfying when you solved them not beautifully. The way a good sentence was beautiful, but solidly the way a well-built wall was solid. Robert Whitmore came in at 4:30. She'd been expecting him. She had been expecting some version of this visit for 2 weeks. She'd built it into her understanding of how the week before the gathering would go. He came in differently than he had the last time. Last time he'd been aggressive, the forward posture, the direct threat. This time he came in quietly, which was more concerning. He stood at the counter and he said, I want to ask you something. Ask. Do you know what you're doing? He said. Not to yourself. I mean, do you know what you're walking into on Friday? The people who are going to be at that gathering, Emily. Important people. People from outside this territory who don't know you and are going to form their opinions of Hayes based partly on who he walks in with. I understand the social dynamics of the gathering, Robert. He's been here 6 weeks, Robert said, and she heard something underneath the words that she hadn't expected, something that sounded less like threat and more like genuine bewilderment. You've known him 6 weeks, and you're going to walk into that room with him in front of everyone and what? And give people something to say about you that you can't take back, that you can't walk back from. He looked at her with an expression that was hard to read. Not warm. Robert Whitmore was not a warm man, but something that wasn't entirely hostile either. "I'm not saying this to hurt you." "What are you saying it as?" Howe was quiet for a moment. "I'm saying it as someone who has watched this town treat you badly for a long time," he said, "and who is not sure this is going to go the way you think it is." The honesty of it surprised her. She stood with it for a moment, because it deserved a moment, not because Robert Whitmore had suddenly become her ally, but because he was making an argument that deserved to be taken seriously. "Robert," she said finally, "I appreciate the warning. I mean that genuinely. But here is what I know." She put both hands flat on the counter. "I have been careful my entire life. I have been sensible. I have managed every expectation and every hope and every small wanting down to nothing over and over again, because I was afraid of exactly the thing you're describing, giving people something to say. And I am standing here at 27 years old, having done every single sensible thing, and I have nothing to show for it except a well-run store and a town that respects my usefulness and has never once seen me as a person." She looked at him steadily. "So I'm done being careful in that direction. If it goes wrong, it will go wrong, but at least it will be real." Robert looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said quietly. He bought nothing. He walked out without another word. But at the door, he paused the same doorway where Charlotte had paused weeks ago, where Nathaniel paused nearly every day and said without turning, "You've always deserved better than this town gave you." Then he was gone. She stood at her counter and breathed. Friday arrived the way important days always do, more ordinary in its first hour than it had any right to be. She opened the store. She did her morning inventory. She wrote 3 letters and sent them. Ruth appeared at 9:30 with a dress she'd altered without being asked, had clearly been working on for 3 days, and presented it without comment, folded over her arm. Emily looked at the dress. She looked at Ruth. "Don't," Ruth said firmly. "Just thank me." "Thank you," Emily said. "You're welcome. Now go in the back and try it on, because if it needs adjusting, I still have 4 hours. It didn't need adjusting. Ruth had done it perfectly, the way Ruth did most things when she decided to commit to them. The dress was a deep blue that Emily wouldn't have chosen for herself, but that Ruth had apparently decided was correct, and when Emily stood in the back of the store wearing it, Ruth looked at her with an expression that had nothing professional about it, just genuine, uncomplicated emotion. "Oh," Ruth said softly. "Emily. Don't cry." "I'm not crying. Your eyes are doing something." "It's dusty back here." Ruth pressed her hands together. "You look like who you actually are, that's all. It's just you look like yourself." Emily didn't answer. She went back to the front of the store and finished the day's work. Nathaniel arrived at the store at 6, not at the gathering directly, which she hadn't expected. She'd expected to meet him there. Instead, he knocked on the locked front door at 6 o'clock, and when she opened it, he was standing with his hat in his hands, and he took one look at her, and something in his face went very quiet. "You look beautiful," he said. She had been ready to deflect. She'd had the deflection prepared, something practical, something that redirected. But she thought of Ruth's voice, "Just accept it." She thought of Ida Marsh's voice, "Don't let their smallness become yours." "Thank you," she said. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked to the gathering hall together. She had been right about Charlotte's planning. She understood the full scope of it the moment they walked through the door, and she saw the room, who was placed where, who was talking to whom, which particular cluster of important men from outside the territory had been positioned near the entrance, where they would have a clear sightline to whoever walked in. Charlotte had spent 4 weeks arranging this room. Not obviously, not in any way that could be directly attributed to her, but with the sophisticated precision of someone who understood social architecture the way Emily understood land and water. The gathering had been shaped so that Nathaniel's entrance with Emily would be witnessed by exactly the people whose opinions would travel farthest. The hall went quiet, in the particular way that a room full of people goes quiet. Not all at once, but in a wave, a ripple of silence that moved from the entrance outward as people turned to look. Emily felt Nathaniel's arm steady under her hand. She felt him make no adjustment, no accommodation. Just walked in at his pace, which was unhurried and direct, and she matched it. She did not make herself smaller. She stood in her actual space. The stairs landed on her, and she let them land without flinching, and that single act of not flinching was harder than anything she had done in the previous 6 weeks, and more important than most of it. Charlotte appeared from the center of the room. She had done this with precision, too. The timing of her approach, the angle, so that she was intercepting them in full view of the room's most important occupants. She wore a dress that was clearly intended to be the most beautiful thing in the room, and succeeded. And she looked at Nathaniel with an expression that was perfectly calibrated. Gracious, faintly concerned, the look of a woman who was about to say something she found genuinely difficult. "Nathaniel," she said, "I'm so glad you made it." She let her eyes move to Emily with the specific practiced warmth of someone performing warmth. "Emily, how nice." "Charlotte," Emily said, "I was just telling Mr. and Mrs. Alderman about your work in the supply trade." Charlotte said, her voice pitched to Carrie to the cluster nearby. "It's so admirable, really, how you've kept that little store running. Your father would be proud." She paused. Of the store. The implication landed exactly where Charlotte intended it to. Nathaniel said nothing. His arm didn't move. He waited. Charlotte continued, turning slightly toward the aldermans and their guests, drawing the room in. "Of course, we were all a little surprised to hear. Well, I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding about the nature of your business arrangement." She smiled at Emily. "You understand how small towns talk, Emily. People get ideas." "People do," Emily agreed. "We wouldn't want anyone getting the wrong impression," Charlotte said, "about what this association actually is." The word association landed like a small, precisely thrown stone. Emily felt the room holding its breath. And then Nathaniel said quietly and clearly, "It isn't an association." Charlotte turned to him. For the first time that evening, her precision faltered slightly. "I beg your pardon," she said. "I said it isn't an association," Nathaniel repeated. His voice was steady, no edge in it, no performance of anger, just a man correcting a factual error. "Emily Carter is not my business advisor. She is the woman I intend to court with her permission, and by her terms, and I'd be grateful if we could all proceed from that accurate understanding." The room did not go quiet this time. It had never fully recovered from quiet since they'd walked in. But something shifted, a collective exhale, a reorientation of attention. Charlotte's face did something complicated. The gracious composure held because Charlotte was very good at her composure. But underneath it, something had cracked along a fault line she hadn't anticipated. "Well," she said. Her voice was still steady. It cost her something to keep it that way. "I believe," Nathaniel said pleasantly, "that you were about to introduce us to the alderman's guests from Billings. That would be very kind of you." He moved them forward past Charlotte into the room. Emily walked beside him, and her head was level, and her shoulders were back, and her feet moved across that floor like she had as much right to be on it as anyone, because she did, because she always had, because the only thing that had ever told her otherwise was the smallness of people who had needed her to be smaller than she was. Behind them, Charlotte stood in the space they'd vacated. Emily did not look back. The alderman's guests from Billings were named Percival and Louise Crane. He was a banker, she was a woman of clear intelligence, who had spent the first half of her marriage being underestimated, and the second half quietly accumulating real influence, which Emily identified within 4 minutes of conversation, and which she suspected Percival Crane had still not fully registered. Louise Crane asked Emily 3 questions in a row about land-water assessment in the territory, having apparently heard something from someone in the preceding weeks, and Emily answered them with the same directness and precision she'd have brought to the counter at the store. And Louise Crane listened with the specific attention of someone who was not being polite, but was genuinely absorbing information she found valuable. "You should be charging consulting rates," Louise Crane said at the end of the 3rd answer. "She does," Nathaniel said with a quiet satisfaction. "At appropriate rates?" Louise asked Emily directly, with a slight emphasis that suggested she had considerable experience with women undercharging for expertise. "I'm considering revising them upward," Emily said. Louise Crane smiled, a real one, not a social one. "Good. Percival Crane, who had been listening with slightly less absorption, said to Nathaniel, "You're the Hayes operation out of Texas." And the conversation divided briefly, and Emily and Louise Crane talked for another 10 minutes about water rights and property valuation and the specific challenges of frontier land management. And at the end of it, Louise said quietly, "Your mother must be very proud of you." Emily thought of her mother, the relationship that was somewhere between functional and complicated, the years of quiet disappointment in both directions. "We have some ground still to cover," she said honestly. Louise nodded as though she understood exactly what that meant. It was an hour later in the middle of the gathering, when the formal part of the evening had eased into something more social, and the music had started, that Charlotte made her second approach. This one was different. She came to Emily alone, not in the sight lines of the important guests, not positioned for the room. She came quietly from the side and she said, "May I speak with you?" Emily looked at her. "All right." They moved to a slightly less occupied corner of the room, and Charlotte stood with a straightness that Emily recognized as the posture of someone holding themselves together through an effort of will. "That was not what I intended," Charlotte said. "Which part?" A small pause. "I intended it to be more. I intended it to discredit the situation. Not you specifically." She stopped, rearranged. "I came here tonight to make people see what this looked like. A man of his position and—" She didn't finish the sentence. "And a woman like me," Emily said quietly. Charlotte didn't deny it. "Charlotte," Emily said, and she said it without cruelty, without the satisfaction she might have expected to feel at this particular moment. "What is it that you actually want?" The question landed somewhere unexpected, because Charlotte's expression did something that Emily had never seen it do in all the years of their parallel existence in Willow Creek. It became briefly uncertain. "I don't know anymore," Charlotte said. It came out smaller than her usual voice, more real. Emily looked at her. At the beautiful face, the perfect posture, the years of being exactly what the town had rewarded her for being, and not much else. "You should figure that out," Emily said, not unkindly, "before you spend any more evenings arranging rooms." Charlotte looked at her for a moment. Then she turned and walked away, and this time the walk had lost some of its precision, and Emily watched her go with a feeling that wasn't quite victory and wasn't quite sympathy, but was somewhere between them, where complicated truths tend to live. Nathaniel found her 20 minutes later. He looked at her in the way that meant he'd noticed the conversation with Charlotte and was reading her expression for information. "All right," he said. "Yes," she said, and she meant it. "She said something to you." And I said something back. She looked at him. "It's handled." He studied her. "You're extraordinary," he said, as though he were simply continuing a conversation they'd started Thursday. "No build-up, no ceremony." "You've said that before," she said. "I'll probably say it again." "I'll probably keep accepting it," she said. His expression did the thing it did, the held-back smile that broke through anyway. "That's all I'm asking." The music had shifted to something slower. Around them, the gathering moved in its ordinary evening rhythms, couples and conversations, and the particular social energy of a room full of people who had come to see what would happen and were now recalibrating based on what had. "I don't dance," Emily said. "I know you don't. You've never been asked." She went still. "That's how do you know that?" "Ruth," he said simply. "She's more forthcoming than you are when she thinks information is relevant." "Ruth told you I've never—" "She told me several things about you," he said with the particular calm of a man who had already decided how he felt about all of them. "Most of which I'd already observed for myself. But the dancing she told me directly." Emily looked at him, thought of Ruth in all her unsubtle, perfectly intentioned loyalty. "I'm going to have words with her," she said. "She'll survive it." He held out his hand. "One dance. I'll make sure you don't have to wonder anymore whether you can." She looked at his hand. She thought about all the dances she hadn't been asked to, all the years of standing at the edges, all the careful management of wanting nothing that could disappoint her. "I step on people's feet," she warned. "I've worked cattle in bad weather for 20 years, he said. "My feet are extremely difficult to damage." She took his hand. They danced. She was not graceful. She hadn't been practicing for years the way Charlotte and the other women had, and her sense of the rhythm was effortful rather than natural. But Nathaniel's hand at her back was steady, and his lead was clear, and after a few bars she found the shape of it, and it became something she could do rather than something she couldn't, and that felt like an exact representation of about 6 other things that had happened in the last 6 weeks. From across the room, she caught sight of Charlotte watching them. Charlotte's face had an expression that Emily hadn't seen on her before, and after a moment she identified it. Not envy of the dancing, not anger at Nathaniel's choice. Something more interior than that. Something that looked from a distance like a woman seeing a thing she'd always told herself wasn't possible, and realizing at the exact wrong moment that she'd been mistaken. Emily didn't feel triumphant about it. She felt something closer to sorry. But she didn't stop dancing. She stayed on that floor in her actual space, in her proper size, and she let the music carry something forward that she'd been holding back for years without entirely knowing it. And she looked at the man across from her who had walked into her store 6 weeks ago and chosen to see her, and she thought, this is real. This is actually real. It was the first time she had allowed herself to think it without immediately arguing against it. She didn't argue against it. And the room with all its watching and its history and its complicated smallness could do whatever it chose with that. Because Ida Marsh had been right. Their smallness was theirs. This was hers. This specific, improbable, real and present moment. She wasn't giving it back. The morning after the gathering, Willow Creek woke up differently. Emily felt it before she even opened the store. She felt it in the way old Silas from the grain merchant lifted his hat to her as she walked down the main street. Not the vague, generic nod he'd always given her, but a specific acknowledgement, the kind that meant something had shifted in his accounting of who she was. She felt it in the way 2 women from the church committee crossed the street, not to avoid her, but to intercept her smiling with the particular warmth of people who had revised their position and wanted credit for the revision. She accepted both interactions with the same quiet steadiness she'd brought to the gathering floor the night before, and walked into her store and opened her ledger and began the day's work. Ruth arrived at 8 o'clock, sat down on the stool behind the counter without being invited and said, "Tell me everything." "You told him I've never been asked to dance," Emily said without looking up. "I told him several useful things," Ruth said, unrepentant. "Tell me everything." So Emily told her the Cranes Charlotte's approached the conversation in the corner, the dance. She told it plainly the way she told most things without embellishment, and Ruth listened with the focused attention of a woman hearing a story she'd been waiting years to hear. When Emily finished, Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You danced." "I did. At the gathering, in front of everyone." "That is where the dancing occurred, yes." Ruth pressed both hands flat on the counter and looked at Emily with an expression that was doing several things at once. Happiness, relief. Something close to fierce protectiveness that had finally found an outlet. "Emily Carter," she said. "I have been your friend for 3 years, and I have never once seen you let anyone do something nice for you without finding a way to pay it back immediately or explain why it wasn't as nice as it appeared." "I thanked him for the compliment," Emily said. "Earlier this week, you told me to." "I know I did, but this is different." Ruth leaned forward. "He said in front of that entire room what you were to him. Before the Aldermans and the Cranes and Charlotte Bennett and everyone. He just said it, plainly." "He corrected a factual error," Emily said. "That's consistent with his character." "Emily." "It was not a small thing," Emily allowed. "I know that. I'm not diminishing it. What are you doing with it?" She looked up from the ledger. "I'm trying to be the person it deserved," she said quietly. "That's what I'm doing. I spent the whole of last night and most of this morning deciding that. Being the person it deserves, not the person this town decided I was." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. "That's the right answer," she said. "I know," Emily said. "I'm occasionally capable of those." Nathaniel came in at his usual time, mid-morning, and there was something different about how he moved through the door. Less the demeanor of a man conducting business, more the demeanor of a man who had something to say, and had decided the time for careful patience with his own intentions was running short. He came to the counter and he said, "The offer on the Clearwater parcel was accepted this morning." She looked up. "Full terms. Every one. Exactly as you structured it." She felt the satisfaction of it, clean and specific, the way any correctly executed thing was satisfying. "The adjoining parcels. You'll want to move within 2 weeks before news travels." "I know. I'll need your help with the sequencing on those as well." "Of course." He was quiet for a moment, watching her. "Emily." She met his eyes. "I want to talk to you about something that isn't the land." "All right. I want to talk about what comes after the land," he said. "When the parcels are secured and the operation is established, and the reason I originally walked through that door has been fully resolved." He paused. "I want to talk about what I want to be walking through that door for after all of that is finished." The store was quiet. Outside, the ordinary sounds of a Saturday morning in Willow Creek moved past voices, a cart, a dog somewhere down the block. "You've been very careful," she said. "I've been trying to be what the situation required," he said. "You needed time and evidence. I understood that. I'm not a patient man by nature, but I understand why patience was the right thing to give you." Another pause. "I think you have enough evidence now." She held his gaze. "What exactly is it you want to say, Nathaniel?" "I want to court you properly," he said. "Not in the middle of land negotiations, not sideways through work and careful conversation, even though that's been—" He stopped. "Even though that's been the best 6 weeks I can remember. I want to do it with intention and with clarity about what I'm hoping it becomes." She was quiet. "I know what this town thought," he said. "I know what you thought, what you'd been taught to think about what was available to you. I'm asking you to put that down." He put both hands flat on the counter between them, and the gesture was so like her own habitual gesture, the flat hands, the grounded weight, that it startled her. "I am not offering you a kindness, Emily. I am not choosing you because I feel sorry for you, or because you're useful, or because I'm making a point to this town. I am telling you that you are the most interesting person I have met in 31 years of being alive, and that everything I want to build here, I want to build with you beside me, because nothing I build without you is going to be as good as it would be with you." That is a business assessment and a personal one, and both of them are true simultaneously. The counter between them. His hands. His eyes, which were doing the same thing they always did, paying complete attention, being present, not hedging. "That's a significant thing to say," she said. "Yes. In my store, on a Saturday morning." "I've been trying to find the right moment for 2 weeks," he said. "I've concluded there isn't one. There's only the moment you're in." She looked at him. At the man who had walked into her store 6 weeks ago and asked for help without pity, listened without performance, returned every day without requiring anything of her except her actual self. At the man who had said extraordinary with the same tone he used for survey data, as though it were simply a recorded fact. "All right," she said. He blinked. "All right. Court me properly," she said, "with intention and clarity. That's what I want too." She held his gaze. "But I want you to know what you're taking on, Nathaniel. Not the useful version, the complete one. I am stubborn past the point of reason on things I've decided. I am not easy to live alongside. I will tell you when you are wrong, and I will be correct most of the time when I do. I take up real space, and I intend to keep taking it up." "I know all of that," he said, and there was something in his voice, warmth, genuine and uncomplicated, the kind that doesn't need to perform itself. "I've been watching you take up real space for 6 weeks, and I haven't wanted you to stop once." She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "The adjoining parcels. I'll have the sequencing drafted by Wednesday. You should also know that I've had a letter from Louise Crane in Billings, who has asked about consulting on 2 properties her family is assessing in the territory, which means my professional rates are about to increase, and that includes my rate for Hayes cattle and land." The corner of his mouth moved. "That's completely reasonable." "I know it is," she said. "It's one of the things I'm very good at determining." He laughed, the real one, short and full, and the sound of it moved through the store and settled somewhere in her chest, in the specific place where things settled when they were real and right and worth keeping. The news moved through Willow Creek. The way all significant news moved faster than anyone had sent it in forms slightly different from the original, carrying the accumulated coloring of every person it passed through. By Monday, the version circulating was that Nathaniel Hayes had publicly declared his intentions at the Frontier gathering and that Emily Carter had accepted. The public declaration part was accurate enough. The acceptance part was being reported with more drama than it had contained in the actual conversation, which had been conducted quietly at a counter on a Saturday morning with flat hands and honest language. Emily tracked the various versions with the detached interest of someone observing a natural phenomenon. Ruth reported them faithfully and with some editorial commentary that Emily appreciated. Old Silas told the grain delivery man that you'd been the obvious choice all along, Ruth said Tuesday morning. His exact words apparently were that anyone with eyes could see you were the smartest woman in the county. Silas has told me to my face on 4 separate occasions that I was pricing myself too high, Emily said. He has entirely rewritten those occasions in his memory. People do that. Doesn't it bother you? Emily thought about it honestly. No, she said. Not anymore. I spent years being bothered by what this town thought about me. It seems wasteful to start being bothered by them thinking something better. Ruth looked at her. You've changed. In 6 weeks. You've been changing for years, Ruth said. But 6 weeks ago something broke open and now I can see it. Emily didn't argue with that. What she'd understood in the quiet of the last few days was that the breaking open hadn't been Nathaniel exactly. Or rather, Nathaniel had been the circumstance. But the thing that had broken open had always been inside her. It had been waiting under all the years of careful management and sensible expectation. Trimming and practiced smallness for the precise moment when someone offered her a genuine alternative. She had been the one who had to choose to take it. That was the part. The town's revised narrative didn't capture the version that had Emily as the obvious choice, the version in which the good ending had been inevitable. It hadn't been inevitable. She had stood at that counter on Saturday morning, and she had chosen to say all right. And before she'd said it, there had been a full moment where she could have said something else, something safer, something that retreated back behind the wall she'd built. She hadn't retreated. That was the thing that mattered. Not Nathaniel's choosing, her choosing. The twist she hadn't anticipated arrived on a Wednesday, 11 days after the gathering, in the form of a letter. It came with the regular post handwritten on paper that was clearly expensive, and the return address was San Antonio, Texas, and the name on it was Margaret Hayes, Nathaniel's mother. Emily held the letter at the counter for a moment before she opened it. She knew it was from Nathaniel's mother, because he had mentioned her carefully, with the specific care of a person giving you information about something that might require navigation. Margaret Hayes was a formidable woman, he'd said, with the particular love of understatement men used when they were trying to prepare you for something significant without alarming you in advance. She opened the letter. It was 3 pages written in a hand that was precise and unhurried, and spoke of a woman who composed her thoughts completely before she put them to paper. The first page was introduction and pleasantries, which Emily read quickly because pleasantries from a woman like this were not the actual message. The second page was the actual message. Margaret Hayes had heard through channels she did not specify about her son's activities in Montana, about the land acquisitions, and more particularly about the woman who had assisted with them and who had subsequently attended the Frontier gathering on Nathaniel's arm. She had several questions which she outlined with a directness that Emily found, despite everything, genuinely impressive. What were Emily's qualifications? What was the nature of her family and her circumstances? What did Emily understand about what it meant to be associated with a family of the Hayes' position in history? And finally, most directly, what were Emily's intentions toward her son? The third page was a request, or an instruction worded as a request, that Emily correspond directly, as Margaret Hayes preferred to form her own assessments rather than relying on second-hand accounts. Emily read all 3 pages twice. Then she set the letter down and looked at the far wall of her store and thought about it. She thought about it for approximately 20 minutes, during which she filled 2 orders and answered a question from the carpenter about nails, and did not lose her place in any of it. When Nathaniel arrived at 11, she handed him the letter without comment. He read it. The expression on his face moved through several stages. Recognition, a complicated affection, something that looked like mild exasperation, held in check by genuine love. "She moves fast," he said. "She does. She wrote to you directly." He looked up. "Not to me. To you." "Yes." "That means she respects you," he said. "She doesn't write directly to people she doesn't respect. She writes to intermediaries and has the conversation through them." "I thought it might mean something like that," Emily said. "I wasn't entirely sure." He put the letter down on the counter. "What do you want to do?" "I want to write back," Emily said. "Directly, with the same directness she used. Answer every question honestly, including the ones that don't have comfortable answers." Nathaniel looked at her. "The questions about your circumstances aren't—" "Nathaniel, I am not going to present myself differently to your mother than I am." She held his gaze. "If who I am isn't sufficient for her, I would rather know that now clearly than discover it later in a way that complicates things that have already been built." He was quiet for a moment. "She's going to like you," he said. "She's going to like you considerably more than I'm sure she currently expects to." "Maybe," Emily said. "But I'm not writing to be liked. I'm writing to be known." He looked at her with that specific attention, the one she'd catalogued and kept and returned to. I know, he said. "That's exactly right." She wrote the letter that evening at her kitchen table, with the same methodical care she brought to her ledgers. She answered every question: her qualifications, her circumstances, the nature of the store, and how she'd built it and what it represented. She wrote about her father and his death and what she'd done afterward. She wrote about water rights and land assessment with the concise precision of someone who knew her expertise was real and did not need to apologize for it. And at the end, she answered the last question, what her intentions were toward Nathaniel Hayes, with 3 sentences that she weighed carefully and kept because they were true. She intended to be exactly who she was. She intended to be honest when honesty was harder than agreement. And she intended, if Margaret Hayes was asking whether she would take care with her son, to say yes, not by softening herself into something manageable, but by being someone worth standing beside. She sent it the next morning. The response came in 8 days, which was fast for cross-territory post, which meant Margaret Hayes had written back almost immediately upon receiving Emily's letter. It was 2 pages this time. The tone had changed. Not warmer, exactly. Margaret Hayes did not appear to operate in warmth as a primary mode. But there was a different quality to it, the quality of a woman who had asked a real question and received an answer she hadn't quite expected, and was revising her position with the same unsentimental precision she'd used to form it. She acknowledged Emily's qualifications without excessive praise. She noted the circumstance of the store's recovery with what appeared to be genuine interest. She asked 2 follow-up questions about specific land assessment methodologies that Emily answered in a return letter the same day. Nathaniel read both letters when Emily showed them to him and said very quietly, "She hasn't corresponded like this with anyone in 5 years. Not about anything personal." Is that significant? The last person she corresponded with that quickly was a land lawyer who turned out to be the sharpest man she'd ever negotiated with, he said. She ended up hiring him. "I'm not looking for employment from your mother," Emily said. "I know." He was smiling the held-back kind. "I'm telling you what it means that she's writing back at all, and this fast." He looked at her. "She's decided you're worth her time." "She's decided I'm worth assessing," Emily said. "That's not the same thing." "With my mother," he said, "it is." The next shock came not from Texas, but from directly inside Willow Creek, and it came in the form of Emily's own mother. Catherine Carter was 61 years old and had spent the years since her husband's death in the careful management of her own grief, her own opinions, and a persistent unspoken anxiety about her daughter that she had never found adequate language for. She and Emily occupied the same town, saw each other. Weekly talked about practical things and navigated around the larger things with the efficiency of people who have been navigating around the same large things for so long. The path is worn smooth. She came to the store on a Thursday afternoon unannounced, which was unusual. Catherine Carter made appointments. She believed in appointments. She came in and she sat down on the stool behind the counter that Ruth usually occupied, and she folded her hands in her lap and she said, "I owe you something." Emily looked at her mother. At the face she knew completely and sometimes understood poorly. "All right," she said. "I heard what happened at the gathering," Catherine said. "I heard what that man said, in front of everyone." She paused. "And I heard from Ida Marsh this morning, who told me several things about a conversation she had with you the week before, and I need you to know." She stopped. Her hands tightened in her lap. "I need you to know that the worry I had, all those years, about what people would think, about what your life would—" She stopped again. "Mother, I got it wrong," Catherine said. Her voice was steadier than her hands. "I know I got it wrong. I was afraid, and I was small about my fear, and I pointed it at you instead of at the things I was actually afraid of. And what I was afraid of was—" She took a breath. "Was that you would be alone, that you would be overlooked your whole life, and I couldn't do anything about it. And I didn't know how to say that, so it came out as worry about what people thought, and whether you were being appropriate, and whether you were making things harder for yourself." Emily was very still. "I was afraid for you," Catherine said. "I was afraid for 27 years, and I showed it badly, and you got the worst of it, and I am sorry." The store was quiet. Emily looked at her mother, at the woman who had spent years standing just slightly too far away from her, whose love had always been real, and whose expression of it had always been wrong, and she felt the particular ache of understanding something fully that you'd only partially understood before. "I know you were afraid," Emily said. Her voice was steady. "I think I knew it was fear. It didn't make it hurt less." "I know. But it means something that you know," Emily said, "that you're saying it." Catherine looked at her with eyes that were doing the same thing Ruth's had done on the morning of the gathering. Something uncontrolled, something real. "He's a good man?" she asked, not with the suspicious undertone of all her previous inquiries into Emily's life. Genuinely carefully asking. "He's an honest man," Emily said. "In my experience, that's rarer and worth more." Catherine nodded slowly. "Your father was honest," she said. "Sometimes it was inconvenient." "Almost always," Emily agreed. They looked at each other across the counter of the store that had been Thomas Carter's and was now Emily's, and the space between them was still there. Years of careful distance don't vanish in a single conversation, but something had shifted in its quality, the way ice shifts before it breaks. "Have supper with me on Sunday," Emily said. "Bring Mrs. Halverson if you want. We'll have an actual meal and talk about things." Catherine blinked. "All right," she said with the specific surprise of someone who has braced for rejection and met generosity instead. "I'm not forgiving everything on a Thursday afternoon," Emily said plainly. "That's not how I work, and you know it. But I'm not holding it either. There isn't enough room in a day for that, and everything else I have to do." Catherine almost smiled. "You sound like your father." "Good," Emily said. "He was usually right." Nathaniel met Catherine Carter the following week on a Tuesday, which happened the way most significant things happened in Emily's life. Not ceremoniously, but practically, because Catherine came by the store when Nathaniel was there, and Emily introduced them without preamble, and watched the encounter with the focused attention of a woman who understood that this particular interaction would tell her several things she needed to know about both of them. Catherine was formal with him. Nathaniel met her formality without being intimidated by it, and without trying to dissolve it with charm, which was the correct instinct. He was respectful without being deferential, and when Catherine asked him direct, unsmiling what exactly his intentions were, he answered her with the same plain language he'd used at the counter with Emily. "To build something serious and real," he said. "Here in this territory. Not as a temporary venture, as a life." Catherine looked at him for a long moment. "Emily has worked very hard," she said. "For a long time without enough help." "I know that," he said. "I don't intend to make her work harder. I intend to be someone who makes the work she loves worth doing." Catherine was quiet. Then she said, "That's a good answer." "Thank you, ma'am." She looked at Emily. Something passed between them, not resolved exactly, but acknowledged. Then Catherine said she had to get back, and she left, and Nathaniel looked at Emily and raised an eyebrow. "She'll be fine," Emily said. "Did I pass?" "You didn't embarrass yourself, which with my mother is more than most people manage." "High bar," he said. "She's been protecting me in the wrong direction her whole life," Emily said. "She's recalibrating. Give her time." He nodded. "Time I have." Ta-tam. The adjoining parcels went through in the sequence Emily had designed exactly on the timeline she'd calculated. And when the third deed was signed, Nathaniel sat across from her at the counter with the paperwork in front of him and said very quietly, "That's it. Everything I came here to build." "The land is the beginning," she said. "The operation takes years to establish properly." "I know." He looked at her. "I'm going to need your help, not as a paid advisor." She looked at him. "I want you to understand what I'm asking," he said carefully. "I'm not asking you to give up the store. I'm not asking you to stop being who you are. I'm asking you whether what I've built is something you want to be part of. Not beside. Part of." The distinction landed. She understood it precisely, the difference between standing adjacent to something and being woven into it. "Yes," she said. "I want that." "There's more," he said. "My mother wants to meet you, in person, not correspondence." He watched her. "She's coming to Montana in the fall. She says if she's going to form a final opinion, she's going to do it with you in the same room." Emily absorbed this. "That's reasonable," she said. "She's not easy," he said. "Nathaniel, neither am I." He exhaled something between a laugh and relief. "No," he agreed. "You are absolutely not." "We'll manage," Emily said. "Honest women generally find ways to manage each other." He reached across the counter. Not for a document, not for a pen. He put his hand over hers, flat and warm and steady, and she let it stay there, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying in that particular moment that the gesture wasn't already saying more clearly. Outside, Willow Creek moved through its afternoon with its ordinary noise and its revised opinions, and its slow recalibration of what Emily Carter was. Old Silas lifting his hat. Ruth's loyalty fierce and true. Ida Marsh and her direct eyes. Charlotte Bennett and whatever she was building toward, slowly out of the rubble of what she'd been. Catherine Carter learning a different language for the care she'd always felt. And here, a counter, two pairs of hands. A store built from grief and work and stubbornness. The deed to a parcel of Montana land with reliable water and a spring that no survey had ever recorded discovered, because a woman remembered a conversation from 15 years ago and understood its value before anyone else thought to ask. This was how things were built. Not in a single moment of choice, but in the accumulation of moments, the daily work, the honest language, the choosing to take up real space day after day, until the space became undeniably, permanently yours. Emily Carter had spent 27 years learning that lesson. She was not going to waste it now. Margaret Hayes arrived in Willow Creek on the third Thursday of September, and she did not send word ahead. That was the first thing Emily learned about her, that she did not announce herself, because announcing yourself gave people time to prepare a version of themselves. And Margaret Hayes had no interest in prepared versions. She had told Nathaniel she was coming in the fall, and she had come, and the first Emily knew of it was when the door of Carter's Supply opened at 9:30 on a Thursday morning, and a woman walked in who did not need to introduce herself, because she had Nathaniel's eyes and his particular quality of attention, and the posture of someone who had been formidable so long, it had stopped requiring effort. She was 60 years old, and she carried herself like 50, and looked at things like 40, which was to say, with the sharpness of someone who still expected the world to be interesting and was generally correct. She wore good traveling clothes, practical and well-made, and she stopped just inside the door and looked at the store. The way Nathaniel had looked at it the first time. That quiet assessment, that recalibration. But where Nathaniel's first look had ended in something like respect, Margaret's ended in something harder to read. She looked at Emily and said, "You're taller than I expected." "Good morning," Emily said. "I don't believe in good mornings until I've had coffee and a reason," Margaret said. "Are you Emily Carter?" "I am." "Margaret Hayes." She crossed to the counter with the directness of a woman who had not once in her life taken the long route to anything. "I've read your letters 3 times. I have questions that couldn't be asked in writing." "I expected as much," Emily said. "Come around the counter. I'll make coffee." Margaret looked at her for a moment. The look had a quality Emily recognized from their correspondence assessment, genuine and unsentimental, with no particular warmth performing itself over the top of it. Then Margaret came around the counter. Emily made coffee. They sat in the back of the store, the same back where she and Ruth had talked through every complicated thing in the last 3 years, and Margaret Hayes asked her questions. They were not gentle questions. They were not designed to make Emily feel comfortable or to ease into the difficult things. They were the questions of a woman who had built and protected something real and was deciding whether the person across from her was capable of being trusted with it. What did Emily understand about what it meant to run an operation at the scale Nathaniel was building? What did she know about the particular pressures of a public position in a territory that was still being settled, where reputation could shift a business deal before any figures were discussed? What did Emily believe she brought to this that wasn't simply expertise, that wasn't just the useful part, as Margaret put it? Her eyes steady and direct, but the rest. Emily answered every question. She answered them the same way she'd written her letters, without softening the edges, without presenting a version that was easier to accept. She talked about the store and what it had required. She talked about the specific loneliness of competence that goes unrecognized. She talked about what she understood about Nathaniel, not as a summary of his qualities, but as a description of what she'd observed action by action over 4 months. When she finished, Margaret was quiet for a moment. "You're not what I was prepared for," she said. "What were you prepared for?" "Someone softer," Margaret said. "Someone who needed him more obviously. The kind of woman who makes a man feel large by being small." She looked at Emily with those Nathaniel eyes. "He's never been interested in that kind. I should have known better than to expect it." "You were protecting him," Emily said. "That's a correct instinct." "He doesn't need protecting," Margaret said. "That's what I had to learn when he was 22 and decided to take over the operation, rather than let me sell it after his father died. He's more capable than most people realize, until they've underestimated him once." A pause. "Which is something you two appear to have in common." Emily looked at her. "You've both spent years being underestimated," Margaret said. "By different people for different reasons. It produces a particular kind of person, either bitter or more solid than anyone expected. You're both the second kind." She picked up her coffee. "That's either the best possible foundation or a complete disaster, and I haven't decided which." "It might be both at different times," Emily said. Margaret looked at her sharply. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed, short and genuine. The same laugh Nathaniel had, the same quality of a sound that didn't perform itself. "Yes," she said. "It might." Nathaniel arrived at 11, which was when Emily had expected him, and the moment he walked through the door and found his mother sitting in the back of the store drinking coffee with Emily. His expression moved through approximately 4 stages in 2 seconds. Surprise, relief, calculation, and then something that looked like a man realizing a thing he'd been nervous about was going to be all right. "Mother," he said. "You're late," she said. "You didn't tell me what time you were arriving." "I never do." She looked at him with a frankness that had nothing unkind in it, just the directness of a woman who saw clearly and said what she saw. "She's exactly as she represented herself in the letters. That's rare. Most people improve themselves on paper." "I know," Nathaniel said. He looked at Emily with an expression that was quiet and warm and completely unsurprised. "That's one of the things." "One of many, apparently," Margaret said. She set down her cup and stood. "I'd like to see the Clearwater parcel this afternoon. I want to understand the operation before I have opinions about it." "I'll take you out after midday," Nathaniel said. "Emily will come," Margaret said. Not a question. She looked at Emily. "You know that land better than he does. I want the right guide." Emily looked at Nathaniel, who was visibly trying not to smile. "All right," Emily said. They rode out to the Clearwater parcel in the early afternoon, And Emily showed Margaret Hayes the land the way she showed everything, without performance, with the specific language of someone who understood what they were looking at and why it mattered. She explained the water table, the spring on the northeast corner, the boundary management, and what it meant for long-term grazing capacity. She explained what could go wrong and how to prevent it, and what could go right if it was managed with consistent attention. Margaret listened. She asked 3 questions, each one precise, each one cutting directly to the thing that wasn't immediately obvious about what Emily had said. Emily concluded, the sharpest person she'd had a conversation about land management with, including Nathaniel, which was saying something. On the ride back, Margaret pulled her horse alongside Emily's and said, "You love this work." "Yes," Emily said. "Not performing it, not using it, loving it." "Yes, my husband was like that," Margaret said. "About cattle. He understood them the way some people understand music, not as a subject, but as a language." She was quiet for a moment. "Nathaniel has it for the business side, the structure of things, how operations fit together. But the land itself." She paused. "He understands it intellectually. You understand it the way my husband understood the cattle." "The land has its own logic," Emily said. "Once you learn to listen to it." "Yes." Margaret looked at her directly. "You'll teach him that." "He might teach himself. He's not a slow learner." "No. But there are things you learn faster from someone who already knows them." Another pause. "My husband learned half of what he knew about cattle from a woman who'd been ranching in South Texas for 30 years and refused to be polite about what she saw. He was 24, and she was 60, and she had no patience for his assumptions, and she was the best teacher he ever had." She looked forward between her horse's ears. "I'm telling you that so you understand that this family has some history of recognizing where expertise lives, regardless of what form it comes in." Emily was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Margaret said. "I haven't finished deciding." "I know," Emily said. "You'll let me know when you have." Margaret made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Yes," she said. "I will." She stayed 4 days. On the second day, she asked Emily to show her the store's accounts, not as an intrusion, she said, but because she wanted to understand the full picture of what Emily had built. Emily showed her everything, all the ledgers, the freight contracts, the renegotiated rates, the debt recovery from the years after her father's death. She laid it out plainly, the same way she'd laid out the land documentation for Nathaniel. "Here is what was, here is what I did, here is what it became." Margaret went through the ledgers with the focused attention of a woman who understood accounts deeply and respected what she was looking at. She didn't comment while she read. When she finished, she closed the last ledger and looked at Emily and said, "You saved this in 18 months. 22 months, Emily said. "I was optimistic about some of the debt recovery timelines." 22 months, Margaret repeated. "From what this shows, most men would have sold in 6. "Most men had other options," Emily said. Margaret looked at her. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly right." She paused. "The accounts for the Hayes operation have been managed by a firm in San Antonio since my husband died. They're competent. They are not this." She tapped the closed ledger. "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think about it seriously before you answer." "All right. When this is all settled, when you and my son have built what you're going to build, would you consider bringing this," she tapped the ledger again, "to the Hayes operation in full? Not as a secondary thing, as the primary financial management of everything we build here." Emily looked at her. "I'm not asking you to stop being who you are," Margaret said. "I'm asking whether who you are would find that work worth doing." "I'd need to understand the full scope," Emily said carefully. "I'd need to know what I was actually taking on before I said yes to it." "Of course," Margaret said. "That's the correct answer." She nodded slowly. "Nathaniel told me you'd say something like that. He said you didn't accept anything without understanding it fully first." "He was right." "He usually is," Margaret said with the specific pride of a woman who raised someone and knows it. "About the important things." No. The twist came on the third day, and it came from a direction Emily hadn't been watching. Charlotte Bennett came into the store. Not with precision this time. Not with the gathered social architecture of the gathering or the careful targeting of her first confrontation. She came in quietly in the middle of a Thursday afternoon, and she came alone, and she waited until the only other customer had left before she approached the counter. Margaret was in the back reading. Emily was at the counter. They looked at each other. Emily and Charlotte across the wood that had been the site of more than one significant conversation. Charlotte said, "Is she here, his mother?" "She is," Emily said. "I heard she arrived." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "I want you to know something, and I'm telling you because I'm not going to tell anyone else, and I need to say it to someone who'll understand what it actually costs me to say it." Emily waited. "What I did at the gathering," Charlotte said. "The arrangement of it, the things I said." She stopped, started again. "I have been told my whole life what I was worth, by everyone. My mother, the town, every man who looked at me." She looked at the counter surface. "What I was worth was my face and my family name, and my ability to be the right kind of woman beside the right kind of man." She looked up. "That was all I was ever taught I had. So when I saw a man like Nathaniel Hayes looking at you the way he looked at you, She stopped. "You defended the only value system you'd ever been given," Emily said quietly. Charlotte's jaw tightened. "I was cruel." "Yes." "I said things to you that I had no right to say." "Yes." "I'm sorry," Charlotte said. And it was not the performed apology of someone managing a social situation. It was the harder kind, the kind that comes from a place where something has genuinely broken open. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I needed you to know that I know it was wrong. Not the strategy. What I believed. What I thought about you." She paused. "I've been thinking about what you said at the gathering. What you told me in that corner. Figure out what you actually want," Emily said. "Before you spend any more evenings arranging rooms," Charlotte said, completing the sentence. "Yes." She looked at Emily directly. "I don't know what I want. I have never in my life been asked that question in a way that expected a real answer. Not my mother, not anyone." She paused. "Except apparently you." Emily looked at her, this woman who had been her antagonist, and her mirror, and her unwitting teacher in the last 4 months. At the real person, under the architecture of Charlotte Bennett, the one that showed up only when everything else had been stripped back. "You're smarter than you've allowed yourself to be," Emily said. "You saw the room at that gathering before I did. You understood the social mechanics of it better than anyone else in that space. That's not nothing, Charlotte. That's actually something if you use it for something worth building." Charlotte was very still. "Figure out what's worth building," Emily said. "Then build it. You have more than you think you do." Charlotte looked at her for a long moment. Then she straightened that perfect posture, but something different inside it now, something less armor and more actual self, and she said, "Thank you." She left without buying anything. Emily watched her go. From the back of the store, Margaret Hayes appeared in the doorway, and Emily understood from her expression that she had heard the entire conversation. "That," Margaret said, "was a generous thing." "It was an honest thing," Emily said. "I'm not sure I was generous. I just said what I saw." Sometimes those are the same. Margaret came forward. She looked at Emily with the eyes that were Nathaniel's eyes, and something harder and older behind them. "I've finished deciding," she said. Emily held her gaze. "You're what I hoped he'd find," Margaret said. "Not what I expected. Better than what I expected." She paused. "Welcome to the family, Emily. I don't say that lightly, and I don't say it twice." Emily stood at her counter in her father's store, that was now her store, and felt the weight of that sentence land in exactly the place it was meant to land. "Thank you, Margaret," she said. "Don't call me Margaret," the older woman said. "We'll figure out what you call me when the occasion makes it necessary." Nathaniel asked her to marry him on a Friday morning in October, which was practical and like him, because October was after the fall supply deliveries and before the winter slowdown, which meant she could give the question her full attention without it competing with logistics. He came into the store at his usual time, and he had nothing in his hands, no documents, no reason for the visit. That wasn't the visit itself, and she knew from the moment he walked through the door. He came to the counter and he said, "You know what I'm going to ask." "Yes," she said. "Will you?" She looked at him. At everything she'd assembled in her private accounting over 4 months, every piece of evidence, every observed action, every honest word said in this store, and at the Frontier gathering, and on the road to the Clearwater parcel. She had enough evidence. She'd had enough for weeks. "Yes," she said. "I will." He reached into his coat and produced a ring that was not ostentatious and not modest, but specific, a dark blue stone that was exactly the color of the dress Ruth had chosen for the gathering, which meant he had talked to Ruth, which meant Ruth had known this was coming and had said absolutely nothing, which Emily was going to address directly and at length. She let him put it on her hand. She looked at it. "It's the right color," she said. "I had help," he admitted. "I know you did," she said. "I'm going to talk to Ruth about that. She'll survive it. She always does." He was smiling, the full one, not the held-back one, the one she'd seen rarely enough that each appearance of it felt significant. "Marry me before spring," he said. "I don't want a long engagement." "Neither do I," she said. "But we're doing it correctly, properly, not rushed." "February," he said. "March," she countered. "February 25th. She looked at him. "That's almost March." "It's also the anniversary of the day the Clearwater deed was signed, which seemed appropriate." She considered. February 25th was a Friday, which was practical. The winter deliveries would be done. The spring planning would be starting, which meant they could integrate the wedding into the operational calendar rather than interrupting it. "All right," she said. "February 25th. He reached across the counter and took her hand, the one with the ring, and held it in both of his, and she let him, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because the moment didn't need language. Ruth, when confronted, was entirely unrepentant. "You're welcome," she said, before Emily had finished the sentence. "I hadn't gotten to the part where I thanked you." "You were going to get there," Ruth said confidently. "Eventually. After you explained why I should have told you, and why the secrecy was a violation of our friendship, and why I should have considered your feelings about being surprised." Emily stopped. Ruth grinned. "Am I wrong?" "You're not wrong," Emily said. "You're also not sorry." "I am extremely not sorry," Ruth agreed. "The ring is the right color. February 25th is a good date. You said yes, which you were always going to say, but needed to do in your own time, and I helped manage the timeline without interfering with your process." She looked at Emily with 3 years of friendship in her eyes. "I am the best friend you have ever had." "You are my only friend," Emily said. "Then I am automatically the best." Emily sat down on the stool and looked at the ring on her hand and let herself feel the full weight of it. Not the romance of it, though, that was real, but the full weight of what it meant. That a life she had organized around not wanting things that could disappoint her had produced something she would have said was impossible if you'd asked her a year ago. That the store and the work and the years of being exactly who she was had not in the end been a consolation for what she couldn't have. They had been the thing itself, the foundation of the real thing. She had not been overlooked her whole life and then finally seen by someone worthy. She had been her whole life building herself into someone worth seeing, and the building had been the point all along. That was the part the town would never get quite right in the story they'd tell about her. They'd tell it as Nathaniel choosing her, which was true, but incomplete. They'd tell it as the outsider who saw what the town had missed, which was also true, but also incomplete. The complete version was this: Emily Carter had spent 27 years becoming exactly who she was without anyone's permission and without anyone's validation. And when a man arrived who was paying real attention, he had seen someone who was already fully herself. You couldn't fake that. You couldn't manufacture it. It had to be built day after day in the ordinary work of a life taken seriously. Ruth reached across and took her other hand and squeezed it once hard. Emily squeezed back. Chatting. The wedding happened on February 25th, on a Friday, in Willow Creek's only church, which held the town, and then some, because people came from across the territory who had heard about Emily Carter and wanted to see for themselves. Louise Crane came from Billings with her husband. Tom Briggs came from 3 counties over. Ida Marsh sat in the second row with the expression of a woman whose advice had been taken and was satisfied about it. Margaret Hayes sat in the front row and cried exactly once briefly and composed herself immediately after, which was exactly how Emily had expected she would cry. Catherine Carter sat beside Margaret Hayes, which had required several conversations and one very direct letter from Emily to her mother, explaining that the two women were going to have to find a way to occupy the same row of seats without making the day about their mutual uncertainty, and that Emily trusted them both to manage it. They managed it. By the end of the ceremony, they were talking in the low, serious tones of two women who had discovered they had more in common than they'd expected, which was something Emily had quietly anticipated and said nothing about in advance. Ruth stood beside Emily at the front of the church and did not cry by an effort of will that Emily recognized and appreciated. Charlotte Bennet sat near the back. She had come. Emily had not expected her to come, and her presence was its own statement of something in process, something still being figured out, something that didn't have a name yet but had chosen to show up anyway, which was always the first step toward anything real. Nathaniel stood at the front of the church, and when Emily walked toward him, he looked at her the way he always looked at her, with complete specific attention, and the room and the people in it fell to the background. The way everything fell to the background when he looked at her that way. The minister spoke. Emily and Nathaniel said the words. When the minister said to speak now or forever hold your peace. The church was completely silent, and the silence had a quality of completion to it, like a ledger where every column had been correctly totaled. She said yes with the same voice she used for everything important, steady, clear, exactly the right volume for the room. He said yes the same way. And just like that, in a church full of people who had once looked past her and were now looking directly at her, Emily Carter became someone who had stopped waiting for the world to tell her what she was worth. She had known for a while. She had simply stopped arguing with it. Ruth cried after all exactly twice and was entirely unrepentant about both times. The town told the story for years, how Nathaniel Hayes had walked into the supply store and chosen the woman. Nobody expected how he'd shocked everyone at the gathering, how he'd loved her plainly and publicly, until the town had no choice but to see what he saw. It was a good story. It was mostly true. But the part they always left out was the part Emily knew mattered most, that she had been worth choosing long before anyone chose her. That the extraordinary thing about Nathaniel Hayes was not that he had seen her value, but that he had been paying the kind of attention that made seeing possible. And that Emily Carter, stubborn, brilliant, difficult, real, had decided at 27 years old to stop being small in spaces that had never deserved her smallness in the first place. That was the real story. That was the one worth telling. And from where she stood on the porch of the Carter Hayes Ranch, watching the land she knew better than anyone beside the man who had learned to know it beside her, the story was nowhere near finished. It had in every way that mattered just begun.